Story 1.
As she walked the last few meters toward her house, she kept yawning, knowing that tonight she wouldn't sleep much because the werewolf would go hunting once again. And this time, she would be the prey. But she never imagined that the beast had already found her scent and was eagerly awaiting the moment to strike, ready to hunt down the girl who had returned from the dead. Once on the porch, Estera caught a whiff of a foul, dog-like smell. The stench lurked beneath the fragrance of fine perfume, but it was strong enough to make her stomach churn. "How did he find me so quickly?" she wondered, pressing the doorbell. It was her mother who opened the door, and from the stern look on her face, Estera knew something had happened. "Mom, what? Where have you been?" "I stayed late at school." "Don't lie to me," her mother yelled, grabbing Estera by the arm and pulling her into the house. "Don't lie to your mother, you brat! You weren't at school all day. My God, why are you dressed like this? Are you trying to drive me crazy?" Her mother's eyes filled with tears once again. "Mom, please. Why do you do this to me? Why do you treat me like this?" "Did you call the school?" "Your teacher came to the house and said he was very worried because you've been missing a lot of classes. So tell me right now, where were you? I didn't know what to think." "My teacher?" Estera shuddered, realizing that the person who had been in her house wasn't her teacher, but the werewolf. What did he look like, Mom? Like any teacher. Now go wash up, have dinner, and get to your room to do your homework. And if I find out you've missed school again or you're wandering around the city, there will be consequences. And listen carefully. I want you home before it gets dark. Is that clear? Do you hear me?" "Yes, Mom. I hear you." And later, after dinner, while her mother was clearing the table, Estera quietly slipped into the hallway toward the phone. The investigator's business card had ended up in the trash, but she had retrieved it the day before. And now, after the werewolf had been so close that her legs had trembled, she decided to dial the number on the card. When someone picked up the phone on the other end, Estera covered her mouth with her hand, hoping her mother wouldn't hear her. "Hello, it's Estera." "Estera." The investigator's voice sounded surprised. "Why are you whispering?" "It doesn't matter. The killer just came to our house, do you hear me?" "What? But—" "He pretended to be my teacher, but I know who he really is. I wasn't home when he came. My mom talked to him. I'm really scared. Can you come tonight and watch over our house? Like in the movies?" "Wait, are you sure it was the killer?" Estera could hear her mother in the kitchen closing the faucet, the fridge door opening, and the sound of red wine being poured into a glass, something her mother had been indulging in more and more lately. "I have to go, please come." She carefully hung up the phone and went back to her room. Police officers don't believe in fairy tales, and their dreams are nothing but nightmares. Perhaps the investigator shouldn't have gone alone to the Nesterenko house. Maybe the man, whose marriage was falling apart before his eyes, should have asked someone else to go in his place and gone home himself, where his wife was waiting. But things unfolded as they did, and on that quiet night, the police captain's car crept slowly down the deserted street, parking not far from the two-story house. Inside the vehicle, the only light came from the phone screen, where the man was trying to calm his wife, who once again was reproaching him for his constant lateness at work. She no longer believed a word he said, and she was right, because in recent months, all he'd done was lie to her. Largely because of this argument, the investigator decided to stay in the car instead of going home, where a cold bed awaited him. And it was this moment that sealed the fate of everyone involved in the terrible events of that night. The beast was too intoxicated by the scent of its prey. It had forgotten to be cautious, and when the moon lit up the deserted courtyards of the town, it set out to hunt the little girl who had dared to challenge it. It ran across the crisp snow with soft steps, its yellow eyes scanning the darkness. Hungry saliva dripped from its fangs, and its pale body itched uncontrollably as rough gray fur tried to push through its thin skin. In her room, Estera stood by the window, dressed in a soft turtleneck sweater. She was trembling with fear and couldn't get warm as she watched the shadows flooding the street. Everywhere she looked, Estera thought she saw the evil eyes of the wolf, and she shuddered every time the old floorboards of the house creaked. In her hands, she held the sheet of paper with the drawing of the design that the blacksmith had forged for her, something that was supposed to be her protection against the werewolf. The piece had turned out heavy and ugly, hardly resembling the beautiful design she had drawn, but Estera carried it with her all night. It was the night of the crossing, the night when all the stars in the sky aligned just as they had hundreds of years ago, when the werewolf hunted a frightened girl through the snowy woods. The same night when the hearts of men turned to stone and dawn was still far off. A dark time, drenched in blood and tears, when no other god remained in the world except the hungry moon. The investigator was rummaging through the glove compartment, trying to remember if he had a couple of cigarettes left, when he saw a man running across the street. "And who are you?" he murmured, adjusting the holster of his gun on his chest as he stepped out of the car. The dark figure, with his coat flapping open, stopped when he heard the car door slam shut. "Sir, hold on a second. I'm with the police. I need to ask you a few questions." The investigator walked toward the stranger, pulling out his badge as he approached. "What's going on? Are you looking for someone?" the man asked as he fastened his coat. "Yes, I'm looking for a werewolf." The investigator moved closer to the stranger, trying to get a better look at his face. Even though the man was standing under a street lamp, the officer couldn't clearly make out his features. It was as if instead of a face, the man wore a rubber mask. The only thing the investigator could remember were the eyes, strangely colored, looking at him with genuine surprise at the unexpected appearance of the officer. "What are you doing around here so late?" "I'm heading home. It's gotten late." "Do you have any identification on you?" "Oh, I'm afraid not." "Then you'll have to come with me to the car. It's just over there. We'll check your identity, and I'll take you home afterward." "Let's go." "Sorry, it's my job." "I understand." As soon as they sat in the car, the investigator turned on the light, trying to get a better look at the stranger. Now, with the warmth and light inside the vehicle, the man's face seemed normal, even somehow familiar. "Do I know you?" the officer asked as he pulled out his phone. "I'll call the station now. We'll sort this out. In the meantime, tell me your last name and—" "Look, isn't that the person you're looking for?" the man suddenly interrupted, pointing to a dark alley up ahead. "What?" The investigator looked up, and almost immediately he felt a sharp pain in his chest. Once, then twice, then 3 times. He straightened up, trying to breathe, but his lungs filled with blood, and all he could manage was to weakly slap his hand against the side window. He saw the man's grin, the man he had intended to run through the police database, and the gleam of the blood-stained knife in his hand. He tried to say something, but realized that instead of words, blood was spilling from his mouth. With trembling fingers, he attempted to draw his gun from its holster, but the grip slipped in his hand, and the weapon became heavier. "You know me," the man whispered to the dying officer. "You all know me. I am the curse your fathers brought upon you, and for which your children will pay." That was the last thing the investigator heard. The light in the car went out, and the heartbeat in his chest, which had seemed eternal, stopped suddenly. But it was the night of the crossing, and in that dark alley, there truly was someone else. Estera sat on her sister's bed, silently staring at the glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling. She had wanted to cry again, like she had that time in the park, but her eyes had remained dry all week. During that time, she had replayed every fight with Orsolya, and the girl feared that in heaven, the echoes of those arguments would keep her sister from being happy. She didn't know how to fix it, because she was only 12, and all the adults around her, even her own mother, had suddenly become mediums, invoking the dead and giving them all their attention and love. A sudden noise from downstairs pulled her from her bitter thoughts. It sounded like someone was jiggling the front door handle. Estera rose from the bed and peeked out of her room, listening to the silence of the sleeping house. The noise stopped, but after a while it came again, and then Estera heard the creak of the door's hinges. Fear crept up her neck, sending shivers down her spine, and the girl tried to smooth them out with her trembling hand. But already a cold, icy sensation was crawling down her back, past her waist, freezing her muscles. She knew it was the beast. The foul stench of wet dog spread through the house, and Estera forced herself to move, not wanting to be trapped in her own room. Clenching her sweaty fists, she tiptoed to the railing and looked down at the first floor. A thin strip of light from outside was seeping through the half-open door. That meant the werewolf was near. It was hiding in the darkness that had gathered in the corners. "Please, God, please don't let me die." Estera crept down the creaking stairs, pressing herself against the wall until she reached the phone. She picked up the receiver and heard the dial tone, her slender fingers beginning to dial the investigator's number, which she knew by heart. "Please, please." The ringing tones traveled through the wires, filling the dark interior of the investigator's car with a cheerful melody. But Estera kept waiting, until the line went dead, and a female voice announced that the number was unavailable or out of the coverage area. Desperate, she began dialing the number for the police station, but she soon realized the phone was no longer responding to her button presses. All she could hear was silence. "No, please," she whispered. The darkness in the corner shifted, and the girl saw a flash of yellow eyes. Then the beast pounced, knocking her to the floor. Estera felt its claws tear through her sweater, ripping it along with her skin. The werewolf pinned down her flailing arms and opened its foul-smelling jaws, bringing its fangs closer to her neck. "No!" the girl screamed, but the beast bit into her throat, its teeth sinking into the woolen collar of her sweater. There was a sickening crunch of breaking teeth, and blood from the beast's shattered gums splattered across Estera's face. The werewolf howled in pain, sliding off her as she scrambled to her feet and ran out of the house, hearing the clinking of the iron collar around her neck. The injured beast lunged after her, its claws outstretched, and chased her into the snowy night. It caught up to her by the investigator's car, grabbing her by the hair and slamming her against the side window. "This time you won't come back to life," the werewolf growled, throwing her to the ground. Through her blood-soaked eyelids, Estera saw a massive claw raised above her, but before it could strike, the beast was knocked down with a furious shout. "You're a damned monster!" yelled the blacksmith. The werewolf roared and fled into the snow-covered street, while the bearded face of the blacksmith appeared over Estera. "Are you all right, little one?" "Yes, But the tears wouldn't let her finish. Estera burst into sobs, and the man scooped her up in his arms. "Shh, it's over now, little one. God, that collar really saved you. You're a brave little girl." At the doorway of the house, her mother appeared in a robe, finally woken from her drunken sleep. She rushed down the stairs, scared and pale, not understanding what was happening. "Shandor, what are you doing here? What's going on?" "Call an ambulance, quick! Do you hear me? She's been hurt!" "My God, Estera, I don't understand. Is that blood?" "Go call a hospital!" the blacksmith shouted at her. "I told you!" The woman, paler than a ghost, disappeared back inside the house. "He cut the phone line," Estera whispered. "Your mother can be unbearable at times, but she'll know how to call from her cell." "Do you really think I'm brave?" "Oh," the blacksmith smiled. "I've never met a braver girl." The beast tried to hide in its lair, but the furious mob was unstoppable. They dragged the man into the street along with his daughter, who pleaded for mercy, but both were torn apart. That night, there was no other god but the hungry moon, and the snow kept falling, watching the faces of the people. But they turned away, refusing to remember the past. And it was then that the snow knew who would grant it immortality. The snow followed the ambulance along the main road, peering through the windows marked with red crosses. The girl who had defeated the wolf lay on a stretcher, her head bandaged, her chest rising and falling in peaceful sleep. Beside her sat her mother, holding her hand. The snow smiled and promised never to forget that night. It promised to forever remember the fragile girl who alone had challenged an ancient evil. It happened in a small Hungarian village. The missing girl was found in the woods beyond the creek. 2 boys had wandered off the path to throw stones into the water and stumbled upon her mutilated body. The first snow of the season had fallen that day. The autumn had been gray and cold, like a deadly illness, and the village awaited winter as a form of release. And finally, the white light filled the world. It would only be 3 months before the frozen earth would begin to thaw, reaching its icy hands toward the warmth of the spring sun. March would come, but the echoes of that terrifying December would remain forever, vibrating in the windows of houses like bleeding ghosts. The girl sat by a tree, her stockings pulled down, her legs splayed like a porcelain doll. There was a gaping hole in her neck, blackened by the blood. Snow covered her small, frozen body, glistening on her eyelashes like petrified tears. The snow still believed that, like nature, this girl would rise again. Around the tree, scattered from her backpack, lay her 5th-grade notebooks and school books, and by the water's edge, a bag with her spare shoes glistened, shoes that would never go out of style again. The snow continued to fall all morning. The footprints of the killer vanished beneath a fresh layer. But the parents of the boys who had found the horrific scene left so many tracks that when the tracking dogs arrived, they could only circle aimlessly, returning time and again to their handlers by the creek with no results. The girl's mother arrived immediately after being notified. By that time, the experts had already worked with the body, and one of the officers had pulled her stockings back up. "She doesn't need to see that," one of them said, his warm breath dissolving into the cold air. "Parents aren't supposed to bury their children, but they do," muttered a young forensic scientist with red hair, removing her latex gloves as she watched the woman run toward her daughter's ravaged body. "My God!" "Pray for her," said a tall man, a local investigator, shivering as he pulled up the collar of his coat. "She still has another daughter, a twin. Somehow they'll get through this together." "And the husband?" "My God, no. Or Solya." The frost-covered trees trembled at the sound of the mother's heart-wrenching scream. People lowered their eyes, trying to hide their guilty glances. "She buried her husband 2 years ago. The war took him," murmured the investigator, staring at the ground. "Such a damned injustice." "Yeah," whispered the young woman, thinking about a hot cup of tea. Death no longer scared her. Her personal life, which was falling apart like a cheap suit, terrified her far more. And only the snow crunched under the knees of the sobbing woman, as if unable to comprehend why this forest had suddenly turned so bitter, and why her hot tears now brought her so much pain. "Don't cry, dear, don't cry. Time will pass and she will rise again. I know. I have seen death and I have died myself. Believe me, you'll see. The earth will return what it has taken. Your daughter will come back to you." On the other side of the red and white police tape, a crowd of onlookers had already gathered, and across the bridge, slipping and stumbling, local journalists with their cameras rushed in. And though it seemed like everyone cared about this terrible tragedy, for some reason, none of the adults considered that the killer might still be nearby. That the dead girl, now resting in her mother's arms, might be gazing with half-closed eyes directly at him, watching as he stood among the crowd, indistinguishable from a human being, while the beast inside him waited for the next night to hunt again, obeying the full moon. No one remembered that beasts always returned to their prey. When it was over, and the mother allowed the paramedics to take her daughter's body, the investigator and the young forensic scientist walked toward the patrol car waiting for them on the other side of the creek. "What do you think, Tunda? That wound on her neck. Where did it come from?" the investigator asked as they crossed the bridge. The young forensic scientist frowned, recalling the bloody hole in the girl's thin neck. Then she smiled. "Are you coming over tonight?" she asked, changing the subject with forced lightness. "Of course. But about the wound, tell me something." "I'll tell you tonight," she replied with an enigmatic smile. The truth was, the investigator and the forensic scientist were in a secret relationship. Sometimes he would go to her house, other times he'd drop by during her shift, and they'd lock themselves in her office. He was married, and she knew it, but preferred to remain silent. Both of them were caught in the intricate web of lies they'd woven during months of furtive encounters, and neither seemed to care about what had happened to the dead girl found in the woods, her throat torn apart. As night fell over the village and the mother's tears dried on her pillow, leaving dark stains, the surviving twin, Estera, opened her eyes and stared at the starry ceiling of her room. It had been her sister's idea to decorate the ceiling like this, so that whenever they couldn't sleep, they could lie back and gaze at the stars. But now the bed across from her was cold and empty, and Estera didn't know which constellations to look at to feel close to her beloved sister again. The bond between twins is always stronger than that of regular siblings. They could always feel each other. Orsolya had disappeared a week ago, and for a while Estera could still sense her, hear the beat of her heart. But then, suddenly, the connection was severed. And though she didn't want to believe the worst, she knew something terrible had happened. So when that morning the two boys found her sister's body by the creek, she didn't say a word. She simply stood up from her desk and walked out into the first snow, slumping under the gaze of hundreds of eyes watching her from the school's gray windows. She reached the park and cried for a long time beneath the old oak tree, which her sister had called the magic tree. They both loved fairy tales and ancient legends, and believed that one day they would find an entrance to a magical world beneath the oak's roots, or at least a chest full of treasure. But things had taken a different turn, and suddenly the beautiful oak tree had transformed into a grotesque monster, stretching its sickly hands toward the dying sunlight. In that single moment, Estera felt the fairy tales disappear from her life forever. With rage, she began to claw at the damp earth with her hands, as if trying to prove to the world that she had grown up, that she was already an adult. But suddenly, her nails scraped something metallic, and she stopped, staring at the shiny lid of a small chest. Estera yanked it out of the earth and, in disbelief, opened the lid. There was no money or map pointing the way to Middle-earth, only a new book tied with a red ribbon, part of an old collection of legends. "The girl who defeated the wolf," Estera whispered, recalling that morning's discovery as she searched for her flashlight. She often read under the covers late into the night, and afterward dreamed of fairy tales until dawn. And that night would be no exception. The book waited beneath her pillow, ready for when the house lights went out. Her mother's sobs subsided, and a deep silence finally settled in. That book was a gift from the beyond, a warning of danger. Estera had heard the horrific way her sister had died, and now, as she read the legend of the werewolf and examined the bloody illustrations, she became more and more convinced that this story, like a curse, had repeated itself with them. And that could only mean one thing: a lycanthrope, thirsty for blood, had come to the village. And the beast thought there was nothing sweeter than the flesh of a child. But what it craved most was the girl whose flesh it had already tasted, but who had escaped its grasp, and survived. Her it desired more than anything. The hunt for her had begun. In small provincial towns, far from the capital, a murder investigation can drag on for months. Without modern technology to identify a criminal with just a drop of saliva, the case files gather dust, and the investigation takes on the smell of cheap coffee. People forget about death when it passes by their doors with its hood lowered, and time heals even the deepest wounds, dulling the pain. In this village it should have been the same because it had happened before. But the day after the burial of the first girl, the police received another report from terrified parents. They begged the authorities to find their 13-year-old daughter, who hadn't come home from school that day. And the nightmare began again. By then, the only thing known about the first murder was that the wound on the girl's neck had been inflicted by a strange creature, like a man, but with extremely powerful jaws. In the report, which was kept secret, the coroner, judging by the strength of the beast, compared it to a gorilla and concluded that the wound on the neck appeared more torn than bitten. But in the same report, it was also mentioned that the semen found inside the victim's torn womb undoubtedly belonged to a human. Thus, the police dismissed any mystical theories and began investigating all the local residents who had ever been detained for child abuse, as well as those registered in psychiatric institutions. And although the village was small, with only 200,000 inhabitants, the investigations dragged on. In the meantime, another child disappeared. Another girl. The beast was clever. Taking the form of a man, it joined the volunteers searching for the missing children in the woods. It approached the exhausted, desperate parents, telling them that everything would be fine, that their daughters would be found alive, even though it knew the children's bodies lay in shallow graves at the edge of the forest. The beast had killed them almost immediately. Hunger was stronger than its will. Then, tormented by its nature, it had fallen to its knees and howled at the moon. Only at dawn did it take up the axe, preparing to return later for its hidden prey. However, when the dogs picked up its trail, it realized its hiding places might be discovered. Secretly, it left food behind, specially prepared for just such an occasion. Poisoned, but not lethal right away. Later, from the shadows, it watched as the animals slowly weakened. That day, the search continued, but without the dogs, the people were disoriented and helpless. That night, the beast returned to the forest to claim its prey. But when it tried to feed, it realized that the rigid, cold flesh no longer brought the satisfaction it had hoped for. The stiff, frozen body gave it no comfort. It understood that dead blood did not quench its thirst like the warm, pulsating life it craved. Hungry and disappointed, it went back home. The missing children were found. Their bodies were taken to the morgue in black bags. The next morning, the investigator knocked on Estera's door again, attempting to talk about Orsolia. The last time he had come, Estera's mother had thrown him out, blaming him for her daughter's death. "Don't yell at him, Mom," Estera said as she went upstairs, "or everyone will think we've gone mad." She only pretended to lock herself in her room. In truth, she stood on the stairs, listening to the conversation, which seemed destined to end in an argument from the start. The foolish investigator was asking Estera's mother about her suitors, and she responded irritably, saying she had no time for that she worked like a mule to make sure her daughters didn't lack for anything. Maybe she knew that Estera was listening, which is why she hid the truth. But the girl already knew about the man her mother was seeing. He was married, and maybe her mother loved him, which was why she didn't want to involve him in all this. Estera knew he worked at the blacksmith's, that he was a little older than her mother, and that he had a family. He couldn't be a werewolf, because if he were, he would have come for her already, just like the old legend said. The investigator seemed uncertain, clearly unsure of how to proceed, and Estera shook her head in amazement at the impotence of adults. But she was only 12 years old, and understood perfectly well that no one would believe her version of events about the werewolf. So she decided she would have to act on her own. The book said the beast always came back for its prey. So the girl steeled herself and went to the funeral of the children murdered by the monster. Estera was sure the werewolf would be there, hidden among the mourners. And when he saw her, so much like one of the girls he had killed, he would not be able to resist. The investigator wanted to talk to Estera too, but her mother, exhausted and furious, ordered him to leave. Estera had to come down on her own to ask the one question that wouldn't let her rest. The man was already at the door, about to leave. "Tell me, do you believe in werewolves?" she asked. "Get to your room right now!" her mother shouted without turning around. She opened the door, waiting for the officer to leave. "Why are you asking me that?" "Please, just go," her mother pleaded. "Because if you don't believe, you'll never catch him." "Estera, I told you to go to your room." "Mom, let him answer." "No, I don't." "Because you're an adult?" That's enough." The woman shoved the bewildered man out of the house and slammed the door, glaring at Estera with fury. "There are no werewolves, remember that. Your sister is gone. God, please grow up. You didn't go to her funeral, so at least show some respect now." "But they exist, Mom. They exist." The woman began to cry again, and the girl stood before her, breathing angrily. "They exist," she whispered, and went back upstairs to her room. The snow kept falling. It looked through the windows of the houses, as if trying to glimpse their past lives, but people turned away, unwilling to remember the past. The snow held a secret. Many years ago, during a fierce storm, a small boy got lost in the woods and came upon a pack of wolves. When the hungry animals were about to pounce, gunshots rang out. The boy was saved by a forest ranger, a man with cold, unyielding eyes. But upon taking the boy to his cabin, the ranger showed that sometimes salvation could be worse than death itself. The man kept the boy locked up for several days while the storm raged outside, but then he let the boy go, and the boy returned to the village alone. However, it wasn't really the boy who returned, but a wolf cub that over the years transformed into a fearsome beast, capable of taking human form. No one knew what had happened in that forest, and over time the boy's story became a legend that, despite everything, remained alive. The cemetery was cold and damp. It was located on a hill near the cathedral, whose stone crosses, like rifle scopes, eternally watched over the surrounding land. The wind howled as it struck the stones and trees, and it seemed as though the dead from beneath the earth were trying to make themselves heard, begging to be let go. The funeral for the children drew many people. Families, classmates, neighbors, and strangers moved by the tragedy. Among the crowd stood Estera, dressed like her sister had been on the day she died. The werewolf was also there, hidden among the mourners, mocking their grief. He held his daughter's hand, his claws digging deeply into her small palm. When the priest finished the prayer and the coffins began their slow descent into the graves, Estera stepped forward and threw a handful of dirt into one of the pits. Her gaze scanned the crowd, but she couldn't see the werewolf. Yet she knew he was there and that he had seen her. Now he wouldn't find peace until he understood why the child he had killed had somehow risen again. And when he understood, he would want to kill her again. That was the challenge a fragile 12-year-old girl threw at an ancient evil. Just as centuries ago, when the beast terrorized a forgotten village, what the adults refused to acknowledge burned brightly in her brave heart. And the beast felt it. It felt the warmth, and the hunger to hunt returned. Estera left the cemetery in silence while everyone else focused on the graves being covered with dirt. She walked quickly but with purpose, avoiding eye contact with the sinister gaze of the beast. But she knew he wouldn't follow her now. He was waiting, preparing for a more opportune moment. She could sense his presence, like a shadow trailing her every step. Estera walked down the main avenue of the town, passing parked cars, glancing at their side mirrors as if trying to catch a glimpse of something that might betray the surveillance. Occasionally, she stopped in front of the brightly lit shop windows, pretending to look at them. But in truth, she was making sure the werewolf wasn't following her. No passerby paid any attention to the girl, and soon she realized the beast had decided to wait for a more favorable moment. She quickened her pace, avoiding alleys and narrow streets, and soon arrived at a small two-story house on the other side of town, near the forest where the murdered children had been found. The wind howled, and large snowflakes fell, covering the path, but the girl didn't care. She pulled up her hood, ran across a deserted snow-covered street, and stopped in front of an old house with a bright sign over the door. The best blacksmith in the world. Estera cracked the door open, and a small decorative bell tinkled softly above her head. She shushed the bell, pressing a finger to her lips as if trying to quiet it, and slipped inside. The blacksmith shop was warm and dark inside, the air thick with the heavy scent of hot metal, making it hard to breathe. From deep within the shop came the loud clang of a hammer striking an anvil, filling the air with a vibration that seemed to seep into her bones. Instinctively, Estera pressed her hands to her chest, trying to calm her pounding heart. She felt uncomfortable in that environment, but she had no choice. "Well, well," said a deep voice behind her, making the girl jump. "It's not often I see such a beautiful creature in here." She turned, trying to appear calm, and pulled back her hood. The massive man standing before her, towering like a mountain, clapped his hands. His unshaven face, covered in soot, seemed to hang from the ceiling, towering so high above her. When Estera had seen him before, from a distance, next to her mother, he had seemed much smaller. "Did you get lost, little girl?" He laughed. "No, I came here specifically for you." "But we don't forge dolls, sweetheart." "I don't need dolls. I'm 12. 12 years old?" The man laughed, leaning down toward Estera. "So, what can I do for you?" "You can help. I need you to make this," she said, pulling a folded piece of paper from her pocket and handing it to the blacksmith. "But I don't have any money." The man took the paper and unfolded it, turning it over in his large hands. "Did you draw this? You designed it?" "I'm good at both. Will you help me?" "Let me tell you something, little girl," he said with a sigh. "You should go home and keep drawing because you're good at it. This thing, I imagine it's for you. You don't need it. I'm not going to make it. No one will. And I bet you don't even know what the criminal code says about things like this." "Yes, I do," Estera interrupted. "And besides, this isn't a request. I already told you I don't have money. It's a gift." "You've got guts," the blacksmith laughed again. "But why would I make you such a gift? Because if you don't, your wife will know you've been cheating on her with my mother." In the silence that followed, the smile vanished from the man's face, and one massive finger pointed directly at the girl's chest. "Careful, girl. Don't play games with me, or I'll throw you out of here." "Help me, please. It's all I'm asking. My sister was murdered." "And you think you'll protect yourself with this? If you know something, go to the police. That's my advice. Don't mess with this. It's dangerous. Take your paper and go." He held out the paper, but she broke down in tears, lowering her head. "For God's sake," the man exclaimed, sighing. "Fine, but keep your mouth shut and don't come here again asking for anything. And definitely don't try to blackmail me. Wait in my office. And one more thing." He looked into her tear-filled eyes. "Promise me you'll go to the police." "I promise, thank you." "I hope this doesn't send me straight to hell." It was only around 6 in the evening, but in these parts winter brought early darkness, so Estera had to walk home in the pitch black. The soft snow crunched under her feet, sticking to the soles of her boots, and the weariness of the day weighed down her eyelids, which felt heavy as lead.
Story 2.
It was early morning when Richard took his dog Baxter for a walk. They walked along the edge of the forest, among ancient pines and fresh grass covered in dew. The dog got a little wet, but it didn't stop him from enjoying another cheerful walk with his owner. Soon they reached a stream, which murmured quietly and shimmered in the light. Richard was feeling a bit tired, so he decided to sit on the nearest boulder. Contemplating the beauty of the morning nature, he involuntarily recalled the past years. He was already 70. Not that he had aged drastically by this time, but time had taken its toll, and he had become less mobile and energetic. He lived in his house on the edge of the forest, which he acquired after his wife's death. She had been gone for about 5 years now, and her absence had a strong impact on him. Loneliness had gripped his soul, sometimes suffocating him to the point of being unbearable. That's when Sarah, his elder daughter, bought him a puppy. Taking care of the animal gradually began to dispel the melancholy, and over time, Richard found it easier. As he watched the running stream, he remembered walking in a similar place with his wife once, and a solitary tear rolled down his face. Interrupting his thoughts, he heard the dog bark. The dog ran around as if asking to continue the journey. "Sorry, Baxter, I'm getting up," the old man said, getting up and continuing along the trail. The walk didn't last long. Richard decided to return earlier and prepare a festive lunch. Today was his late wife's birthday, and he wanted to mark the occasion. When he opened the gate, he realized it wasn't locked. Someone had come to him, probably Michael or Sarah. Only they knew he kept the keys under the geranium pot. He lifted it and made sure the keys weren't there. Then he walked into the house without concern. Opening the front door, which was also unlocked, he walked into the kitchen, where he found a man around 35 years old of short stature, skinny with black hair. It was his son Michael. He was leaning into the open refrigerator door, searching for something inside. When he saw his father, he straightened up, and instead of greeting him said, "Damn, old man, your fridge is empty again. What do you even eat?" Richard sighed tiredly and walked past him sitting on a chair. "There's bacon in the cupboard, you can take it," he said. "Great," Michael said. Leaning down, he opened the cupboard door, took out a plate of bacon, and after popping a piece into his mouth, sat on a chair opposite and said, "How have you been? It's been a while since I was here. Baxter misses you, but here he is, by the way." Michael beckoned the dog and threw him a piece of bacon. "I see everything's fine with you, whereas things aren't going so well for me." At this point, Richard looked at his son and pondered where he had gone wrong. They raised 2 children. Although their family wasn't wealthy, they managed to provide both with a university education. The elder, his pride, graduated with honors, then got a good job, got married, and had 2 children. The younger one, however, dropped out of school and, associating with the wrong people, got involved in shady dealings. They and his wife always hoped he would mature and straighten out, but it never happened. Michael constantly got himself into trouble. Perhaps this partly contributed to his wife's death. She loved her son and constantly worried about him. Their savings went into paying off his debts, and one day she left them unable to bear the pressure. Then Richard cut off all ties with his son, and after selling their large house in the city, moved to this secluded place. But the estrangement didn't last long. One day Michael came to him, apologized, and promised to do better. He got a job at a car repair shop in town and seemingly stopped associating with those bad guys. Richard forgave him, as he loved his son. Perhaps their excessive love with his wife had ruined him. They should have been stricter with him in his childhood. Also, he was constantly absent at work and didn't pay attention to his son. So Richard partly blamed himself for what had happened. "Here's the thing, I need your help," Michael said. Seeing his father's displeased face, he quickly added, "No, I don't need money." "Then what do you want?" Richard asked in surprise. After he asked the question, Michael pulled out his smartphone from his pocket, opened the local news website, and handed it to his father. Richard squinted, trying to understand what it was, then stood up, went to the cupboard, took out his glasses, put them on, and slowly sat back down to read. Here's what was written there. On Tuesday, a young couple went for a walk in the woods, where, according to their words, they encountered a mystical creature known as a wendigo. They miraculously escaped, barely managing to flee. Currently, the frightened couple is in the hospital undergoing treatment, including psychological assistance. After this incident, there were disputes online about the truthfulness of their words and the existence of supernatural beings. The heated debates were fueled by a local millionaire, who announced that he would give $1 million to anyone who brings video or photo evidence of this creature. As a sign of his seriousness, he created a special account, which he handed over to the local authorities. This announcement caused a stir among local enthusiasts, who rushed into the forest in huge crowds. We hope to learn soon whether the wendigo really exists, or if it's just the imagination of cryptozoologists. Reading the article, Richard nodded. This doesn't bode well, he thought. He looked up at his son and asked, "So what do you want?" "Didn't you understand?" asked the son. "You spent your whole life as a ranger in this forest. Remember, you told me once that you encountered this creature. Why don't we go there and take a photo, then we'll become rich? It's a chance of a lifetime." After his words, Richard remembered that day. They and his partner were patrolling the area when they felt a chill in the middle of the summer day. What happened next often haunted him like nightmares. They barely survived then, and never ventured into that part of the forest again. These memories sent shivers down his spine, and he became angry with his son. Taking the nearby cane, he began to strike him with it, saying, "Idiot, do you think this is a joke? This is really dangerous. If you came here for such nonsense, you better leave. I thought you remembered your mother's birthday, but you've come up with some nonsense again." Michael tried to defend himself from the blows, trying to calm his father down and howling in pain with each hit. Soon they reached the exit when he cried out, "Stop. I'm not asking this just for myself. I was recently at Sarah's and she's having big problems now. Something happened to her husband. I'm telling you the truth. Stop. Ow." Richard pushed his son out the door, saying that Sarah was already grown up and could handle it herself. Then he slammed the door, locking it. Michael's moans could still be heard on the doorstep, but soon he left, not getting what he wanted. Though Richard was angry, he was worried about the news about Sarah. She was his favorite, and never caused any trouble. What happened to her? He thought. He took out his phone and called her. She didn't answer immediately. Her voice sounded tired, which worried her father. He asked how she was and requested her to come over. She said everything was fine reluctantly, and agreed reluctantly to visit him. She came the next day. She brought her children with her. Jonathan and Emily were 10 and 7 years old, respectively. When they saw their grandfather, they ran up to him happily and hugged him. Richard loved his grandchildren and often spoiled them. After kissing the children, he hugged Sarah, who had a big belly. She was expecting her third child. He noticed her tired and worried face. Leaving the children to play with the dog, they went to the kitchen where Richard began to inquire about what had happened to his daughter. Sarah didn't want to worry her father, but she finally gave in. It turned out that her husband's company went bankrupt, and he's dealing with lawsuits and other problems. She can't go to work because of her pregnancy, and all this piled up on them at once. Richard silently listened to her, pondering something. Then the children rushed in, interrupting their conversation. After spending half a day with her father, Sarah and the children left him. He stood on the porch, watching them leave, and waved goodbye to the children. When the car disappeared around the corner, Richard continued to stand there. He watched the beautiful sunset and pondered something. An hour passed. His face showed that he had made a decision. He entered the house and dialed his son's number. A disgruntled voice sounded on the other end. Richard only said a few words. That he agreed, and that Michael should be with him in the morning. He didn't listen to his son's joyful shouts, just hung up. Then he went to the chest of drawers where their family photo was kept. It showed his wife and children when they were still young. Looking at the photo, a warm smile appeared on Richard's face. He remembered the times when he was happy. Early in the morning, he started his old pickup truck and headed to town. The journey took half an hour. The first thing he did was go to the hunting store. He hadn't been out anywhere for a long time, so he needed things for the trip. There he was, greeted by a 45-year-old man dressed in denim overalls and a red shirt. It was Jeremy Stronghold, his old acquaintance, who was surprised to see the old man. "Hey, Richard, what brought you here?" he said, shaking his hand. "Hey, there's something I need to do. For that I need a couple of things." Richard handed the list to the salesman, who turned it over, scratching his chin. "As for the flamethrower, I'm not sure. There might be some left in the warehouse." He went out the back door and soon returned with the necessary items. There were a first aid kit, a camping pot, a machete, a flashlight. The salesman also pulled out a flamethrower, saying that luckily there was one left. It was a small device with a fuel tank. It could easily fit into a backpack. After that, Richard picked up a rifle. Jeremy looked at him suspiciously, squinting, and when he received the payment, he asked, "Listen, Richard, aren't you going to the forest for that creature? You spent your whole life in it. You must know its secrets. For such money, even such an old wreck like you can take action." The old man didn't reply, just nodded his head. Taking the goods, he left the store while Jeremy watched him with a long, grim stare. Richard needed to stop by one more place. It was a small market where they sold organic food. They also sold chickens and their eggs. He walked among the cages and chose the biggest and fattest one. After making the purchases, he hurried home. His wayward son probably already awaited him. When he arrived home, he saw an unfamiliar Jeep decorated with skulls and flames. Richard didn't like it. He entered the house and saw a stranger. It was a man in his 30s with long curly hair, dressed in colorful attire. From his appearance, it was clear that he was some kind of hippie, though Richard didn't know what they called such people these days. "Who are you?" he asked. But before the man could answer, his son rushed out from the next room, saying, "Old man, where have you been?" Then Richard asked Michael again, "Who is this?" "This is my buddy, Billy. He will help us with the filming. Don't worry, I've already settled with him about the share," his son replied. The old man grumbled, looking at the pair with dissatisfaction, and went to get ready. Going up to his bedroom, he opened the chest of drawers and pulled out his old ranger uniform, which he had kept all this time and which had already gathered dust. Shaking it, he put it on and looked at himself in the mirror. It still fit him well. Satisfied with what he saw, he adjusted the collar and went downstairs to continue getting ready. Soon he brought out 2 backpacks in which he put tents, sleeping bags, and other necessary items for the trip. He handed one to his son and took the other one himself, also slinging the rifle over his shoulder. Billy carried the filming equipment, a couple of cameras, and some other device. Michael, seeing his father wearing it, said, "What are you doing, old man?" But then fell silent, understanding something. After that, Richard locked up Baxter at home, leaving him food and water for a couple of days. Going out into the yard, he pointed to the chicken coop, telling his son to take it. Michael was surprised and was about to ask why they needed it, but seeing that his father was already in a bad mood, he just picked it up. When they stepped outside, Michael thought they would go by car, but the old man headed towards the forest. Stopping at the edge, he turned to his son and said, "Before we go any further, I have one condition. You'll give half of the money to your sister." "As you say, I was planning to do that anyway," he replied. The old man nodded at that, and they continued their way. They slowly made their way through the dense forest, stepping on the soft ground strewn with pine needles and autumn leaves. Twigs sometimes crackled under their feet, and around them there was only the sound of nature, the rustle of leaves, the singing of birds, and the distant sounds of unknown animals that occasionally awakened in this dense world. They moved forward, relying on lightweight hiking poles, occasionally stopping to look around or catch their breath. Richard, despite his age, walked confidently and purposefully, leading them through thickets and avoiding fallen trees. He knew this forest like the back of his hand, having spent most of his life here. Michael, on the other hand, seemed less confident in this area, but still tried not to lag behind his father. His gaze constantly slid over the surrounding trees and bushes, searching for something unusual or threatening. Billy carried the camera on his shoulder, occasionally stopping to capture one or another landscape that caught his eye. His gaze was full of curiosity, but deep down he felt anxious, as the purpose of their journey was far from ordinary. As they delved deeper into the forest, the surrounding nature gradually changed. The trees became older and denser, and the undergrowth thicker, creating the feeling that they were entering another world. The air was filled with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, enhancing the atmosphere of the unknown and mystical. Finally, they emerged into a small clearing, beyond which lay a low fence marking the boundary of the cemetery. It was an old Indian cemetery, forgotten and abandoned by time. Ancient tombstones and stone slabs with long faded inscriptions stretched along uneven rows, while wild flowers and shrubs grew between them. The place exuded a sense of peace, but at the same time sadness for the departed worlds. This was a landmark for Richard. They needed to go strictly north from here until they reached a small valley. They stopped for a small break, taking out a couple of sandwiches from their bags, which Richard had prepared in advance. Chewing on the food, Michael asked his father what this place was. The old man didn't reply immediately, as if recalling something. Then he said that once there was a sanctuary here, belonging to one tribe. An Indian acquaintance of his told him about it. They worshipped a spirit here that ruled these lands. Every year offerings were made here, but over time, people started leaving, and the sanctuary was abandoned. And so, since there were no more offerings, the spirit could be angered. That's why his acquaintance asked him not to go to this area under any circumstances. But of course, Richard didn't listen to him. which almost ended in tragic consequences. Finishing their meal, the guys were ready to set off, but then the old man pulled out a huge dagger from his bag and menacingly approached Michael. "Old man, what are you doing?" he exclaimed in fear. But Richard kept moving towards him, saying nothing. When he reached his son, who recoiled in fright, the old man bypassed him and went to the chicken coop, opening it and pulling out a chicken. It started flapping its wings, trying to escape, but he held it firmly and carried it towards a small altar. Various symbols were carved on it, but the main one was a deer skull with horns. Holding the chicken by its legs, Richard made a swift stroke with the knife, causing blood to spill, and its head flew off to the side. After it stopped moving, he laid it at the foot of the altar. The guys watched this scene, mouths agape. Meanwhile, the old man, after this, grabbed his belongings and headed further down the trail. The guys snapped out of their trance-like state and hurried after him. They continued through the dense forest until it gradually began to thin out. Soon the trees cleared and marshy terrain began. Frog croaks and insect chirps filled the air. Richard led the guys, trying to stay on solid ground and avoid the bogs. As they passed by the water, they noticed a skeleton at the bottom. The water was crystal clear, so they could see it in detail. Most likely, the skeleton belonged to a deer. It was hard to tell for sure as its skull was missing. This was somewhat unsettling. Where had the head gone? After a brief pause and recording it on camera, the travelers moved on. Finally, the marsh ended and a slight ascent began. After that, they walked along a plateau covered with bushes until they reached the valley below, which was covered in dense forest, looking somewhat ominous. Suddenly, a flock of birds soared above it as if startled by something. Richard stopped and said that they would make camp for the night here. They set up their tents and lit a fire. It was starting to get dark, so they hurried to prepare dinner. After cutting up some meat, they cooked it in a pot, then added water and let it boil. After that, they added some vegetables and potatoes. The result was a kind of stew, which turned out surprisingly tasty. Billy remarked on it, to which the old man said that food cooked over a fire always tastes better than stove-cooked. When they finished eating, darkness had fallen, and Richard began to explain that tomorrow they faced a dangerous path, especially when they entered the forest located in the valley. Therefore, they needed to be extremely vigilant and cautious, as well as film everything, as the creature could appear at any moment. The guys silently nodded. They were scared. This place inspired some kind of horror. You couldn't feel it just by watching a video or hearing a story. You had to experience it on the spot, as if you were under the influence of some field. The trio continued to sit, discussing various things. Richard talked about his experience as a ranger, recalling the most vivid cases when suddenly a scream rang out from somewhere. It was a soul-piercing cry, as if the victim had experienced unearthly horror. The guys jumped up and looked around, their faces reflected fear. They tried to determine the source of the sound, but darkness surrounded them. It was a new moon, so there was almost no light from the Earth satellite. Suddenly, they heard another scream, this time from a different direction. What could it be? They turned to the old man, but he sat in the same position, quietly sipping tea, as if he hadn't heard anything. He asked the guys to sit down and calm down. They complied, albeit reluctantly, constantly looking around for danger. Richard explained that this was the harbinger of the wendigo, and when travelers heard it, it meant they had to leave. These screams would sound all night, so he pulled earplugs out of his pocket and handed them to the guys. Putting a pair in his ears, he himself went into the tent. The guys were shocked by his composure, but it seemed that he had already experienced this and was handling it better than they were. Before lying down, they recorded on the camera. None of them could fall asleep. Terrifying screams echoed through the camp all night, interspersed with the old man's snores. In the morning, Richard emerged from the tent and saw the tired faces of his companions. They had dark circles under their eyes and disheveled hair. It was clear that they had tried to sleep but couldn't. The old man shook his head disapprovingly, but then remembered how he himself ended up here the first time. After that, he lit a fire and brewed coffee. Passing each of them a cup, he told them to prepare for the journey. They packed up their tents and cleaned up after themselves. Then Richard pulled a flamethrower out of one of the bags and handed it to his son. Showing him how it worked, he explained that he should use it when he said so. The son silently nodded, asking no questions. They left the bags at the camp, taking only the weapons and cameras with them. After that, they slowly made their way down. As they descended, Michael asked his father why he wasn't afraid. He remembered his face when he first told him about this place. And back then, the old man's face expressed horror. Now he was calm and collected. Richard replied that sometimes a man had to let go of fear for the sake of his family's survival. These words didn't sit well with his son. Something troubled him. Soon they reached the edge of the forest. Here, huge boulders lay as if the remnants of a once great wall. Approaching closer, they noticed strange symbols on them. Billy had already turned on the camera and was recording. Their path now lay through the forest. It seemed mysterious and eerie. It was unclear what created such an atmosphere. Perhaps the trees grew close to each other, or the fact that almost no other plants grew under them. Finally, as they entered, they headed deeper inside, constantly looking around. Everything was quiet for a while. They walked another half-mile when suddenly they felt it getting colder. Michael felt himself freezing, but other than that, nothing else happened. Richard pondered. Could it be that he appeased the spirit and it didn't attack them? Then that was a problem because they needed recordings with it. Suddenly, he saw tracks on the ground. He leaned in closer to get a better look. The tracks were large, much larger than any human footprint, with long, elongated fingers ending in sharp claws. Richard frowned, trying to recall if he had ever seen anything like this in his many years as a ranger. But there was nothing similar in his memory. He followed the tracks, which went in a straight line through the forest floor, bypassing bushes and jumping over fallen trees. Every step the Wendigo left behind was clear and confident, as if the creature had no trouble moving in its natural environment. Suddenly, the tracks abruptly ended at the edge of a small ravine. Richard looked around, searching for a continuation, but found nothing. It seemed the creature had silently leaped over the obstacle, leaving no sign of its presence on the other side. He looked at his son and his friend, contemplating whether to go further, when suddenly they heard noise behind them. They quickly turned around and prepared their weapons. Richard ordered Michael to hide behind a tree, while he stood behind another, raising his gun. Meanwhile, Billy jumped into the bushes from where he was filming. They waited in suspense, expecting to see who would emerge from behind the trees. A shiver ran through them, and sweat trickled down their faces when suddenly two people appeared before them. They were dressed in hunting suits and were carrying weapons. It was evident that it was a father and his son, who was about 25 years old. Richard recognized the elder one. It was Jeremy, the owner of the hunting store. But what was he doing here? They saw that they had been discovered and raised their hands in a gesture of goodwill. Richard emerged from behind the tree and asked them what they were doing there. "Sorry, old man," Jeremy replied. "I figured you knew where to find this creature and couldn't miss this chance. We've been following you all this time, and judging by these tracks, it seems it wasn't in vain. Let's be civilized. Whoever finds this creature first gets the reward." "Bastard!" Michael exclaimed, but Richard stopped him. "Let them do what they want. This is not a place for arguments." What worried him more was the fact that they probably hadn't made offerings like he did, which could anger the spirit with their arrival. As if reading his thoughts, a strong wind blew. It was unnatural in such a dense forest. The wind was very cold. At first it was quiet and silent, but then it began to intensify and turned into a howl. Richard shouted for everyone to gather together and hide near the crown of a massive tree. It was difficult to do so. Nearby, near the roots of the adjacent tree, lay Jeremy and his son. The wind intensified, almost turning into a hurricane. The guys were afraid they would be swept away. Moreover, they began to feel cold, causing their teeth to chatter, and steam started pouring out of their mouths. As soon as the wind subsided, pitch darkness fell around them, darker and denser than ever at night in the forest. It felt like they were blinded. The silence that followed the storm was so deafening that every rustle made their hearts skip a beat. Suddenly, whispers emanated from the depths of the forest, as if the wind continued to howl. But now it sounded like words in an unknown language. The whisper quickly grew, taking on ominous tones, until it turned into a deep, rumbling voice that surrounded them from all sides. Richard and his companions huddled together, trying to find shelter in the embrace of the forest. Their breathing became heavy and erratic from fear. Then, unexpectedly for everyone, the darkness receded, and a figure appeared on the edge of the clearing. It was tall and emaciated, with long, sinewy arms ending in claws. Atop its head sat a deer skull with long, twisted antlers, which stood out against the darkness. The creature's eyes glowed red, piercing the darkness. The wendigo stood motionless, observing them, and its breath was heavy and deep, filling the air with cold. The creature took a step forward, and the earth beneath its feet rustled with dry leaves. Its movements were slow and deliberate, as if it were weighing each step. Suddenly it raised its hand towards them, and in the air appeared a thin, almost invisible layer of frost, which began to slowly descend to the ground, covering it with a white blanket. Richard felt the grip of his gun handle moistening in his hands. He turned and asked Billy if he had made the recording. Billy trembled and didn't answer immediately, so Richard had to shake him, which brought him to his senses. After that, Richard repeated his question, and Billy answered affirmatively. The deed was done. It was time to run. He shouted to his son and his friend to follow him, but then he saw Jeremy jump up, grabbing his weapon, and head towards the creature. The old man yelled for him to run and not to do anything stupid, but the hunter didn't listen. Standing next to him, his son opened fire together with him. Loud shots echoed through the forest, deafening it, but the wendigo kept standing, and then, as if dissolving into thin air, appeared a few feet away from the hunter. Swinging with sharp claws, it cut his weapon in half, causing the father and son to recoil in fear. Richard shouted for them to run and didn't look back at them, rushing in the opposite direction. Two of his companions followed after him. As they ran, Richard felt the cold emanating from behind. Turning around, he saw everything around turning into an icy chill, and Jeremy and his son turning into pieces of ice. This sight shocked him. It was painful to see his old friend perish. he realized that the situation was much more dangerous than he had thought. Clearing his mind, Richard focused on escaping. They ran with all their might, trying not to look back. Suddenly, an impenetrable darkness fell again, and to his horror, he lost his companions. Turning on his flashlight, he found that the light seemed to be swallowed by the darkness, which plunged him into despair. So he wandered in the darkness, crying out and calling for his son, but no one answered. Suddenly, from somewhere to the side, he heard a painfully familiar voice that he hadn't heard in 5 years. This voice twisted his insides. He turned and saw his wife, Martha, standing literally 10 feet away from him, warmly smiling, and then she called him to her. Richard's mind went blank. He missed his wife so much that he threw caution to the wind and quietly, slowly walked towards her. With each step, she came closer so he could see the wrinkles on her face. It seemed that all troubles had left him, and he found himself in paradise. When he was just a couple of feet away from her, suddenly a bark sounded, which made him snap out of it. His wife's face turned into a terrible grimace, and she hissed. After that, the darkness dissipated, and he saw his dog Baxter. Tears streamed from Richard's eyes. He realized he had fallen into a trap, but it was difficult to break free from it. He sat down and petted his dog, thanking him for saving him. The dog just happily wagged his tail as if saying, "What are you talking about, master?" He didn't have time to ponder how his dog ended up here. At that moment, memories of his son flared up in his mind with renewed strength, pushing him to search. The path was long and exhausting, but in the distance, the flickering of flames from a flamethrower caught his attention. With his heart racing, he headed towards the source of light. Approaching, he found his son alone amidst emptiness, seemingly struggling with an invisible enemy, turning around and shouting, continuously directing the stream of fire. In despair, Richard began to call him, trying to snap him out of it. For a while, the young man didn't react, but finally, his gaze cleared of fear at the sight of his father. Panic reflected in his eyes, seeing the destruction he caused. At that moment, the old man decisively took his son's hand, and together they hurriedly searched for Billy. Billy was quickly found. Out of habit, he had hidden in the bushes. Reunited, they set off again, feeling the relentless pursuit at their heels. It seemed like darkness enveloped them, bringing with it a piercing cold. Looking back, Richard saw the silhouette of the monster behind them. This vision almost weakened him, but the old man found the strength to run as fast as his exhausted body could. It seemed like the cold began to recede, but a sudden cry from his son made his heart stop. Turning around, he saw his son fall into a small pit, from which it was difficult for him to escape. In the distance, he saw the figure of the wendigo swiftly rushing towards them. Michael tried to climb out, calling for help. "Father, help me!" These words made Richard see not an adult son before him, but a little 3-year-old boy whom he once loved to carry on his back. This boy, tearful and desperate, pleading for help, called to him. He remembered how he first held him in his arms when he was just a baby, how his wife whispered to him that he looked like an angel, how he first put him on a bicycle, how they spent time together at his job in the park. Then Richard made his final choice. Rushing to his son, he helped him out of the pit, snatching the flamethrower from his hands, and yelled at him to run. But his son couldn't believe his words. The old man grabbed him by the shoulders, looked into his eyes, and said, "Run and live in a way that you won't be ashamed of later, and be sure to take care of your sister." Michael refused to leave him. Tears streamed down his face, but his father shouted again for him to run, and he ran. Finally, Richard could breathe calmly. He grabbed the gun and opened fire, but it was futile. So he switched to the flamethrower. He waited for the creature to close the distance. Suddenly, he felt something rubbing against his legs. He looked down and saw his dog. "No, Baxter, go run, save yourself." But the dog didn't leave, just barked, then turned around and snarled angrily at the approaching monster. When the creature was just a few feet away from him, he ignited the flamethrower, and the stream of fire shot forward. There was a horrifying scream, and an incredible coldness enveloped everything again, freezing everything around. It froze Richard, who stood unwavering, and his dog stood in a fighting stance next to him. The last light faded from the old man's eyes, ending his journey. The monster approached his head as if trying to peer into his soul. From the openings of its skull, where its nose should have been, cold vapor burst out. Meanwhile, Michael and Billy ran out of the woods and headed back to their camp. Michael was engulfed in grief. There was no expression on his face. Gathering their belongings, they headed back home. They arrived by evening. To their surprise, Sarah was there. Apparently, she had released Baxter. Her face showed deep concern, and upon seeing her brother, she hurried towards him. He, lowering his head, didn't want to speak, but eventually he told her about what had happened. When he finished, there was a slap. It was Sarah slapping her brother, and in tears she went upstairs. Michael didn't react to this. He felt he deserved it and worse. Meanwhile, Billy called rescuers, who headed to the scene but found no one there. However, the recording they made was made public and caused a stir. Money was raised, and Michael handed part of it to Jeremy's family. He also helped his sister's husband. Finally, he had money, but having it didn't make him happy. This incident radically changed his life, and he tried to live in a way that wouldn't disgrace his father's name. 6 months later, on a quiet winter morning, Sarah decided to visit her father's house. She never decided to sell it. Leaving her child with the nanny, she arrived at the place. The old house hadn't changed at all. Upon entering, she started cleaning. Wiping the floors and dusting the shelves, she noticed a photo album on top of the dresser. Opening it, Sarah discovered the chronology of their family's life. Memories flooded her, and she burst into tears. But suddenly, from outside, she heard the barking of a dog, and then the sound of the front door opening. Who could that be? She wiped her tears, put the album back in place, and headed for the exit. When she stepped into the hallway, she saw a person standing in the doorway, smiling warmly at her. Her legs lost their strength, and she took a step back, saying, "You?"